Right. Hello, everybody. Oh, we're a long way back there. Oh, now you remember, if possible, can you see and hear me back there? Are you sure? Because normally we have the last line of desks actually on the boundary of the two rooms. That's the way we normally arrange it. There's room here. If you wanted to come up here, are you sure you can hear back there? You must have X-ray. You must have binoculars to be able to see the board. I think you might be better. What can we do? Is it possible to move like an extra table in there and move forward a bit? Because I mean, these guys here, you could move forward a bit, couldn't you? And let these chairs come forward a bit, maybe. And maybe you could get another table in. Sorry to be disruptive, but I just don't think those people at the back are going to be able to see anything. So if you can move that table forward, and then we can get another two tables in here at least. And there's you might be that table. Oh, good idea, good idea. That is actually two tables, although I don't really fancy constructing it. I'll leave that to you. You can construct the table.
One of these.
Well, I don't know if you want to construct it. I have no idea how to construct a table.
You've got one here, so you just sort of lift it up.
Oh, right, okay. Okay, this is great.
It's very clever.
Oh, right. Oh, you know, I've never done that before. I just assumed it was going to be worse than that. Yeah, I've learnt a new skill. Excellent.
I know we had to do this like the whole of the statistics lab. It's like,
so if you bring two or three chairs up here, there's two tables here.
Then there's something else, session something.
The register is going around.
No one will sit there.
Amazing. Lulu, there's a chair here. Do you want to come forward to the front? Special chair. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, after that exciting redistribution of furniture, I need your attention. We can't do anything with it, or without it. We can't learn anything without it. Although interestingly, when we asked a large cohort of trainee teachers whether they thought you could learn anything without paying attention to it, they thought that you could. So, well, it's about 43% thought that you could, which really shows that the ordinary everyday idea of attention, at least amongst teachers and probably amongst the general public, is slightly different to what we mean in psychology. How would you describe attention in the brain or in the mind? How would you describe it scientifically? Anybody want to throw an idea at me? It's not easy, actually. I mean, if you haven't come across the technical definition, but the technical definition is the allocation of processing resources. So that's what happens when you pay attention. You allocate mental processing resources to something. You can't learn anything without allocating mental processing resources to it. So in the psychological sense, in the scientific sense, you cannot learn without attention. But of course, teachers see the children at the back of the class chatting away. Their idea of attention is not talking, eyes front on the teacher, on the board. You know, but actually that we have to be more precise than that. You can still actually have your eyes front and all the rest of it, but you may not be paying attention. But they see those children sometimes learning. And of course, it is possible, I think, to learn things unconsciously and to not know how you've learnt them. That's true. But, and that's a very interesting phenomenon, implicit learning. But you'll still have allocated mental processing resources to it. You'll have still paid attention to the stimuli in some respect or another in order to learn it. Anyway, I digress already. I only just started. Working memory, very closely related to attention. So I think we should talk about that to begin with. Then we'll talk about a cognitive concept. So this is the sort of thing you might come across actually in your cognition and learning lectures. You're seeing a lot of me, aren't you, this week? I've just realised you saw me yesterday for cognition and learning. You'll probably see me later for a workshop, some of you. The supervisory attentional system is a cognitive concept, but it's important because it sort of ties in nicely with how we think about the neural correlates, what happens in the brain when we allocate attention, when we decide we're going to attend to something. And that features very much the anterior cingulate cortex and the prefrontal cortex, so we'll look at those regions. And then we'll go on to disorders of attention, and particularly we're going to focus on ADHD. And I know that many of you, well, not many of you, I don't know, put your hand up if you're thinking of doing ADHD as a topic. Oh, okay, yeah, quite a few of you then are thinking of doing that. So we'll look at that in more detail. Now, unfortunately today, there are so many brain pictures. I looked at the brain pictures and I thought, can I really produce artistic impressions of these that are going to be meaningful to the students? Or if I photocopied them out, would you be able to read them? Because I felt last week that the black and white was not terribly helpful. And I thought, no. So today, we can't record this visually, but it is being recorded by sound onto YouTube. So I should warn you that anything you ask will be broadcast publicly, etc. Oh, I pressed the wrong button. That was close. Okay, so wrong computer. So working memory. A very simplistic way of thinking about this would be as a sort of a holding bay where you place things that are in your conscious attention. So working memory is your ability to hold things in your conscious attention. And it is very much related to activity in the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. But if you think of attention as the prolongation of that neural activity, and remember that question at the end of the quiz that almost all of you got right, I mean, looking at the monkey, that type of prolongation of neural activity could probably occur in many different areas of the brain. And in fact, I can't remember actually from that study, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was visual cortex that was having the prolongation, or at least visual parietal cortex that was having that prolongation of neural activity. So that sort of mechanism might occur in many different places of the brain. And in fact, we do see working memory activity in many different parts of the brain. But dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is the classic area, this sort of band at the top. And so when you say something like, oh, we walked across the beautiful Golden Gate Bridge, and I think I gave you an example of this previously with the Bristol Suspension Bridge, you know, you've got shape, ideas about shape, which may be stored in inferior temporal regions, ideas about color, maybe temporal occipital regions, location, parietal regions are strongly associated with those different aspects of a concept. All of those will be brought together and held in your working memory buffer temporarily in order to think about this concept. Okay, so it's for holding these transient representations of task relevant information, and it's particularly associated with this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex area. Now, in cognitive neuroscience, we are trying to link the psychology, what we understand about the mind, to what we understand or what we can actually observe in the brain. So we will probably be sensible to start off with a model such as Baddeley and Hitch's famous working memory model. Now, have you come across this in cognition and learning? Yeah. Good. Okay. Okay. And say, well, where is this Baddeley and Hitch model of working memory? Where is this in the brain? Yeah. So we're going to maybe ask people to store phonological things, store visual things, maybe look at when they're actually reallocating things to their to different areas and see which part activates the central executive, which part is activated with the phonological loop, which doesn't work out terribly well. So this is one of the problems It's one of the tensions between psychology, if you like, and neuroscience. And these mysteries are the things that are being unlocked by cognitive neuroscience, which is all about linking these two areas together. So to some extent, you can see some difference in representation of visual and phonological working memory components, but actually there are many other factors that seem to influence where in the brain the activity increases in relation to working memory use. And for example, one of these is whether in fact you are just holding the information temporarily. Do you remember this correlates to the STSS, short-term storage space, I think, that we had in the information processing lecture yesterday. This idea that sometimes you just need to hold the information in your mind, you're not doing anything with it. So if somebody gives you a phone number, before they're dictating it to you over the telephone, in between them saying it and you writing it down, before you write it down, maybe, it's actually held in this temporary space. You're not doing anything with the information. But if you were doing a sum with it, say you were multiplying it by 2, then that is you're actually manipulating the information. So you're actually processing. This is processing inside your working memory. So this is a different operation, if you like, operational significance of what you're doing with the working memory. And then we see that depending on whether you're using it or just maintaining it, whether you're manipulating it or whether you're just maintaining it, we see different regions of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activating. So, and in actual facts here, we're looking at the difference between spatial and non-spatial. So non-spatial could be like phonological loop. And this doesn't work out terribly well. You can see that the spatial, which might be the visual spatial sketch pad of Baddeley and Hitch, and the phonological loop, which is the blue non-spatial blips, are actually a bit mixed up. They're very mixed up in the right hemisphere. So it's not as if the brain is actually ordering information according to the Baddeley and Hitch model. So is that a problem for the Baddeley and Hitch model? Well, I would say possibly yes, because we know at some point in the future we have to try to match up how we think it happens in the mind with what we see happening in the brain. Otherwise, our model of the mind is probably not very accurate, because the mind has to have a neural basis, has to be closely related to what's going on in the brain. On the other hand, when we look at the difference between maintaining and manipulating information, statistically, there is a greater separation between the blue, which is the maintenance plus, in other words, the manipulation, and the red, which is maintenance only. So it's better separated in terms of what you're doing with the information than it is with what type of information it is that you're holding in working memory. So, this is an issue you're going to come across. You came across it with emotion as well, that sometimes we have these quite simple and helpful in many respects models of emotion in terms of these basic emotions. But when we look in the brain as how they're coded, it's a bit of a mess. So actually the reality of how we code these things is different to the psychological box and arrows model. Okay, so that's all very well. Maybe it's coded in different areas according to different factors, but how do you decide it's going to go into the box, into your working memory in the first place? Well, there is an argument about this, and I've given you a reference to look more closely at that argument, because some people will say, oh, actually, it's all about the anterior cingulate. And where is the anterior cingulate? Do you remember where the anterior cingulate is? Because you can't see it very clearly from the diagram. Anybody remember? It's in the middle. It's in the middle between the hemispheres. Yeah. So the cingulate means island, and it's actually an island of cortex between the hemispheres. And anterior means front. Yeah. So actually, what's being shown here is all of the cingulate. And if that's the back of the brain, you can see a bump there, which is the cerebellum. Then the anterior cingulate is actually the front part of this island of cortex between the hemispheres. Anterior cingulate is thought of as being very important for attention, because whenever we do something which is difficult or novel or different or requires the allocation of resources, then we see the anterior cingulate activating. By the way, if my light starts flashing red, tell me, because it means I've got to change the batteries. Okay. So the anterior cingulate, probably very important for attention. On the other hand, the prefrontal cortex has a lot to do with these higher level reasoning processes. And it stands out as being an obvious choice for being in charge, because such a lot of higher level reasoning takes place in these frontal lobes. So there's a big argument about who is in charge. Who is in charge of putting that information into the working memory? And the argument is resolved in a rather complex and sophisticated way by saying that there is a bidirectional interaction between those two areas. And of course, we are getting very close. Yeah, I mean, so Felicia's laughing because actually this bidirectional explanation comes up an awful lot. You may notice nature, nurture, you know, in terms of emotion and cognition, unconscious and conscious thought processing. It very often comes down to a bidirectional interaction. And actually, that's a word that I'm probably going to see in your essay. So write it down. Bidirectional, very important word. Here we go again. More bidirectional activity. So we see the possibility that the prefrontal cortex may act as some sort of dynamic filtering system. So it operates in relation to the anterior cingulate, which may be actually doing some of the work, but the prefrontal cortex is actually filtering what the anterior cingulate is going to do. Of course, these discussions are very difficult because we are getting closer and closer to the dreaded C word, which is cause. That's a good dreaded C word, actually. That's a good one. I like that. We are getting closer to the cause of another dreaded C word, consciousness. Yes. And I sort of feel whenever anybody wants to do their poster on consciousness, I always say, no, don't go near consciousness, because it's so complicated and there's so many philosophical issues and arguments involved with what is our core being, the core. And obviously, it's an incredibly fundamentally important question. And it's fascinating, but it's so difficult to get involved with. And of course, now when we're talking about who is in charge of putting information in terms of our consciousness, we're getting very close to that question, aren't we, of where in the brain we are. Pause for thought. Okay. So we tend to see a bidirectional influence between these two regions, and it would be wrong to say necessarily that one or other is in charge, but prefrontal anterior cingulate networks are the place for your executive attention. And so it sort of operates somewhere between these two. Here in this diagram, Corbetta, but this is going back to 91, is sort of emphasizing the idea that the anterior cingulate is in charge of drawing information. And it probably does have this important role, but it doesn't mean that there's not interaction going from the prefrontal cortex that is filtering what this anterior cingulate is doing. The anterior cingulate is helping in terms of drawing in information from visual orientation, from word meanings, from visual features into your working memory in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And what we find is that if we're, you know, this anterior cingulate therefore increases its activity whenever we say, oh, start thinking up words, or start thinking about where you are visually, or start thinking about what visual features you see here. But interestingly, it increases its activity even more when you are swapping between these areas, because it means you're having to reallocate attention, which is something the executive attention has to do. So anterior cingulate, very important. And we'll be returning to it. But for the moment, you know, we might say that the anterior cingulate is a potential candidate for the home of the supervisory attentional system. That's this psychological model of executive control, indicated very closely related to the executive function that you saw in the Baddeley and Hitch model. And we think it's the ACC because the anterior cingulate cortex is a good candidate because it increases activity with difficulty, novelty, error correction, overcoming habitual responses. All of those things require additional executive attention. Actually, the anterior cingulate seems to activate with doing almost anything in an fMRI task. You usually see some anterior cingulate activity. Okay, not that one, this one. So this is, in terms of, I mean, one way of trying to find out who is in charge is seeing who acts first. When I say who, I mean which region activates first in a task, because presumably that's the region that is in charge. Now, we can't do that with fMRI. Well, we can, but we can, actually increasingly we can do that now using very clever computational models, but it's difficult because fMRI has very poor temporal resolution, so not good at timing. So EEG has excellent temporal resolution, not terribly good in terms of where in the brain, but very good at when, down to milliseconds. So they asked people to do an EEG study. It's a particular type of EEG study. It's an ERP study. And ERP stands for evoked. I should have that on there. I apologize for not. Sorry, event-related potential. Event-related potential. In other words, we are looking for the correlates of a particular event using EEG that many other people have identified. There's a particular pattern in the EEG signal, which we know is always correlated to a particular event. And here, I think it's related to generation. Is that right? Why are we getting an ERP? I've forgotten actually what the ERP is. They have different codes. So there's like the NP200 and such things. But basically, in these two conditions, they asked people as a control simply to repeat what they saw. So they saw the word chair, and they would just say chair. In the generative condition, they asked them to do something additional, which is to generate a new word associated with the word they see. And because this increases the cognitive load, that's something that you can pick up very easily using EEG. And what we see in the signal is different regions of the brain activating at different times. And the first one to activate, or the first two that activate, are the cingulate and the prefrontal cortex. Up it goes and then drops away. And the second one that activates looks like association or temporal cortices. Well, hang on, where's it gone? Yes, temporal cortices here. So this is information probably stored in the temporal cortices in the network there, being brought forward into the working memory. But the first thing that fires off is prefrontal and cingulate cortex. So somewhere there is the person that's in, not the person, is the network that's in charge. Of course, we did used to think it was a little person. If you go back 300 or 400 years ago, you have the concept of the homunculus, where they used to picture what was happening in the brain in terms of a little person that was sort of in charge. Okay, so EEG tends to indicate that somewhere between the prefrontal and the cingulate cortex, there is the basis for executive attention. And yeah, if you want to look at this paper, Gehring and Knight, it's an old paper, but it rehearses the arguments quite well in terms of why we no longer think about one or other as being in charge, but we think about it as a dynamic network, dynamic interaction. We can go further into the anterior cingulate cortex and find that, in fact, different regions are differentiated according to different aspects of the function. So if you are doing a task which is particularly cognitive, and here they've plotted activations from all the tasks which are particularly cognitive, not having any emotional element, 2 plus 2, 3 plus 4, 4 plus 2, then you find those sorts of tasks activate the ventral regions, or the dorsal regions, dorsal regions, the superior regions of the anterior cingulate here, yeah? But the emotional task, if you give people a very difficult emotional dilemma, saying the sort of things they think up these horrible problems whereby, I don't know, there's like 10 adults in a balloon and 20 children of half the weight. Who do you throw out or whatever? And you have to think, oh God, it would be awful throwing out the children, awful throwing out the adults, whatever. There's some sort of moral balance involved, some agonizing emotional decision that you have to make in this vignette. Then you find when people are trying to puzzle that out as to what's the best thing, you tend to find the more ventral regions of the anterior cingulate appear to activate. So there are clear affective and cognitive divisions inside the anterior cingulate. Oh, okay. So are there any questions on that before we go on to ADHD? So that's the basis of executive attention in the brain. And it's relevant because we're going to, in a minute, we're going to see some images of children or adults, actually, I think, with ADHD, and we'll see some sort of differences in the activation of those regions. Okay, so ADHD. There is a huge discussion to be had about ADHD, but I think we've already discussed a little bit before the idea that the neuroscience and the genetics doesn't necessarily make a qualitative distinction between people with and without ADHD. To a large extent, it is a socially and culturally defined label. So when people are very impulsive or very hyperactive beyond a certain threshold where it's actually interrupting their day-to-day life, then we can say, according to a more careful set of criteria, that this person has ADHD. What we find, I mean, you would assume, I think, that the population of people who have ADHD is not increasing greatly, but the medication is increasing greatly. And some of the, I mean, these days, most, this is a more up-to-date graph. So this is the way in which UK methylphenidate prescriptions were going. I found this graph up to 2006 here. So that's down 1991. And you can see that 1991, 1995, it suddenly starts taking off in a big way. And it's sort of increasing linearly all the time. And I plotted a figure on here for 2013. I don't know what the 2014 figure is, but I think it's extremely likely to be somewhere up there. And you can see it's just a linear increase all the time. More and more children being, well, presumably mostly children being diagnosed with ADHD. And so not just diagnosed, but receiving the methylphenidate. So what is ADHD? Well, it is a description of a behavior. It doesn't explain anything. It really is just a collection of symptoms. The explanation for it is still the object of research. But it tends to be associated with three basic characteristics of behavior: inattentiveness, overactivity, and impulsiveness. However, you can see that some of these things do depend on context. So overactivity, and I would say actually inattentiveness, quite often depends on the activity that you're involved with. And that's something that we can discuss a little more. So often, children with ADHD, if they're playing a video game, they are attending. So we have to, we have to think about this. What we're really talking about is attention given to particular contexts which we regard as culturally important, such as classroom and learning. But all of these, you can sort of imagine, might be dependent on that executive attention system that we've just discussed. So obviously inattentiveness, if you've got a problem there, but overactivity as well, because overactivity could be caused by you simply not being able to pay attention in a sustained way to one activity. So you're constantly going from one to the next. And then impulsiveness, possibly because you're not really attending to some of the issues or the cultural aspects of the situation, that this is not really a situation where you should just be shouting out. In fact, the teacher has asked you to put your hand up. So this is a very classic issue for children with ADHD, that they'll just blurt things out without putting their hand up. So actually, some of you are teachers. Put your hand up if you're a teacher. So keep your hand up if you've taught children with a diagnosis of ADHD. So vast majority. If I'd asked, I know when I asked that question sort of 6 or 7 years ago, probably it would have been many smaller percentage. That's quite interesting. When I was a teacher 10 years ago, I think, was it 10 years ago? Might be a little bit longer than that actually. I remember being told that I had a child with ADHD coming into the classroom. And my heart sank, really, because I knew nothing about ADHD or how to deal with that child, and nobody was telling me either. Is it any better now? What do they tell you? Put your hand up if you, those teachers, can they put their hand up again who received, have been teaching children with ADHD? Can you put your hand up if you didn't receive any support in terms of how you should actually approach that child? So you didn't receive any support? Oh, good lordy lord. Okay. Yeah. Yes, I know. Yes. But Hazel, you were on the issues in neuroscience and education unit, so we've all talked about this. but it is a very interesting issue, and you're absolutely right. And you know, these are the sorts of things that we do need to discuss, because it's about labeling and some of the value of that labeling, but also some of the downside of that labeling as well, isn't it? You know, and it's a very difficult thing, because if I go around telling everybody, oh, these developmental disorders, they're just some arbitrary sort of line in the sand that I mean, that it could be wonderful news for a government that wants to withdraw funding, couldn't it? So this is a very difficult area. Sorry, you were asking.
Some of these children don't get a statement because some of them can actually accommodate. They might show symptoms in one of those areas, so they can have a resolve, and that they can, you know, it doesn't actually mean that they can't help themselves, they can't control themselves. Some are actually really good at compensating over their behaviours. They're not completely impulsive.
Yeah.
It all depends.
Yeah, it is. I think we are all on the ADHD spectrum at some point, though, aren't we? And there is a questionnaire. If you decide to do your dissertation in this area, there's a questionnaire where you can actually find out where your participant is on the ADHD spectrum and see if there's anything correlated with that outcome. I think I am probably a little bit above average, I would say. I find I'm constantly distracted. I'm never doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And if I ever attend a lecture with you, which I do sometimes, you'll find that I have trouble behaving myself sometimes because I get bored very easily. I have a very low boredom threshold, which I think is all part of the sort of thing a little bit. There's some interesting videos. I don't know if I've got a link to them on here, but I don't know. Do they come on later on? No, they don't. Okay, but there are some interesting videos you can find on the internet which help you not so much diagnose, but give you an indication of whether you might be an adult with ADHD, and a lot of the issues that are raised, like relationship problems and these sorts of things. I mean, they're quite commonplace. And sorry, yes. Oh, is there? Which? Slide 25. Oh, okay. Oh, well, we'll look at that in a minute. I don't want to. We'll look at that in a minute, and you can decide whether you. You know, is it? I mean, I'm not talking. I don't want to appear to be attaching any levity to this. This is a serious issue. Untreated hyperactivity is the strongest risk factor for poor mental health in adult life, in early adult life, and it's also a very good predictor of criminal behaviour as well. It doesn't mean that if you've got ADHD you're going to be a criminal, but it is a factor, you know, that contributes to the likelihood of that. Is it a social problem? You know, is this just something that's created socially? Well, it doesn't appear to be. What appears to be the case is that, in fact, you've got a strong interaction between the genetics and the environment. So it's about those two things. We can't say just because you've got a particular gene that you're going to get ADHD, but there does appear to be a strong interaction between certain types of genes and certain types of environment. We'll look at that in a minute. Is it a physical biological problem? Well, as I say, that there are genes that have been identified as associated with it. But another way of looking at genetics is to see the heritability, the likelihood of a child having it if their parents have it. And you know, using twin studies and those sorts of techniques, we can see that there does seem to be a high heritability, 0.7 to 0.8, which is very high. But there is this strong genes-environment interaction the genetic expression is different in different environments, and the sum of the genes and the environment is greater than the individual contribution of either. Oh, this was the example I was going to mention. This is fascinating, but there is research that shows, and you have to think about this, okay, so pause for thought, focus, get your executive attention going there. Anterior cingulate should be activating at this point. Negative parenting by adoptive parents correlates with the biological parents' antisociality. Okay, so you've got parents who are adopting children, and their behavior in terms of whether they're good or bad parents is correlated with the antisociality, the poor behavior of the biological parents of the child, which is fairly strong evidence for the fact that sometimes it is the child actually that's causing the problems in the relationship between the parent and the child, if you like. So more scientifically, it shows that children alter the environment that parents make for them. You're still trying to work that one out. Okay, so you ever think about that one? There are corresponding alterations in brain structure and corresponding function. But these are subtle and they're not diagnostic. So when we see differences in brain function, we can never say, oh, that brain image means that the child has ADHD. You can never use brain imaging in that way. And, it is possible because we have experience-dependent plasticity to get the same types of differences that you see between ADHD and non-ADHD participants through, environmental impact alone. So there's a wide range. If you're doing an essay on ADHD and you're looking at all the different regions that may be affected, you're going to end up with a bit of a mess, basically. And it's a mess that you have to review in some way or another. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, well, working memory. Ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, emotional decision-making, maybe. Parietal cortex. Ooh, association cortices. Dorsal anterior mid-cingulate cortex, that's different as well. It can be very important in decision-making. Striatum, very important in reward-seeking behavior. Cerebellum, important for all sorts of timing decisions. All of those regions have been identified as different in people with ADHD, or let me say, people who have been given the label of ADHD. So is that proof positive of the biological basis for ADHD? This is a question I could be asking in the workshop after lunch when we're talking about cause. Because hell, if you're saying that if you've got ADHD, the likelihood is that all those different brain regions are a little bit different to other people. It's quite, you can imagine how a lot of people might get pulled in by that. Hazel.
But that's when you look at people who've been diagnosed with ADHD. There might be quite a lot of people who have ADHD with it.
Yeah.
That haven't been diagnosed with brain tissue not good enough.
Yeah.
So that's like an unknown quantity, isn't it?
Yes, and actually the variety and the range of the brain regions is kind of a little bit disorientating, at least in terms of developing a scientific theory for what's going on. My guess is, and no one's ever done this experiment, but my guess is that you could divide people in terms of a lot of arbitrary categories, like, for example, whether you have good table manners or bad table manners, and you would find a whole range of brain regions that had developed in a different way as a result of that. Not as a result, sorry, that are associated with that difference. See how easily even I slip into cause-effect language, and you have to be very careful of it. They're associated with table manners. But it doesn't mean that table manners are a biological, have a biological cause to them. So the environment, basically what I'm saying is the environment affects the development of all of these regions, just as the environment we know affects the development of behavior. So this in itself is not evidence. What it is evidence for is, in a way, is, as I say, a difficulty in trying to determine what the biological basis of ADHD is if there is some initial brain region that is responsible. So, potential problem. I mean, I think one of the places that you might want to look at in particular would be the anterior cingulate, because we know that that's very much related to executive attention, where you're going to put your attention. So a study that was done by Bush in 1999 showed anterior cingulate cortex dysfunction in ADHD adults compared with non-ADHD adults when they were doing the counting Stroop test. The counting Stroop test is when you put words like 222 on there, and you're asked how many words are there, and of course your brain is wanting to say 2, but you know that actually you've got to allocate attention to a counting task where you actually go 1, 2, 3, and that conflict puts extra strain on your anterior cingulate because it has to pull away from the automatic response of reading. And in terms of activating, we see that normal controls activating their anterior cingulate very well when they're doing that task. ADHD diagnosed adults having difficulty activating their anterior cingulate cortex. So that, although you can also see that there's an increase in activity here, which might be some sort of compensatory strategy. I don't know. I think what helps is a theory that is being developed in the last 5 years or so. And really, this was a great relief for students writing essays on ADHD, because this has some sort of unifying potential to it to explain why all of those different brain regions might be involved. And it is this dopamine deficit theory that the striatum, the midbrain region, is not increasing, it's not uptaking dopamine in response to potentially rewarding situation, potentially rewarding stimuli in the same way. And so what's being measured here is activity in the ventral striatum. For example, the nucleus accumbens. Do you remember the nucleus accumbens? That's your desire center. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll activates the nucleus accumbens. We've also, I'm pleased to report, visceral types of activity, such as being told that they're going to get $1, $2, $3 in a particular task. 20 cents, $1, $5. And here we see the ventral striatum activity in response to that. And the controls are actually activating at all levels of those rewards higher than the adults, I don't know if they're adults, than the participants diagnosed with ADHD. So the reward system of people with ADHD appears to be underactivating in response to reward. And that's very important, because remember that the reward system, that uptake of dopamine, can actually orient attention. So you see chocolate cake, maybe automatically, maybe it's a bottom-up response. It is probably if the reward system is involved. And immediately you go, oh, chocolate cake. Okay, that's midbrain dopamine activity orienting your attention. Now, if you don't have such a response, then you're not going to be oriented towards the chocolate cake any more than anything else. And so your attention is more likely to be going backwards and forwards between that and this and that and this and that. There's nothing guiding your attention at that visceral level, that day-to-day level. Now, this is helpful because, I mean, why might we get more excited about this than the anterior cingulate, for example? Well, essentially because I'm just showing you here, this is the striatum. The ventral striatum is the bottom part, and the particular part that we're interested in for reward anticipation very often is the nucleus accumbens. It's a little sort of pea-size, dense collection of neurons. why are we particularly interested in a potential deficit in the reward system rather than the anterior cingulate or any other part of the cortex? Yeah, because this is a subcortical system which is influencing, it's inputting into all these other cortical regions, and it has a lot to do with organizing and influencing the plasticity of the plastic cortex, which can change very much its connections and its roles in terms of different ways. So it goes back to the neuroconstructivist concept that if you have a problem in a system, that's going to be probably more influential in terms of development than knocking out a piece of your cortex or a bit of the cortex, not working terribly well. We know that from amazing studies. For example, a study of two boys who both had half of their cortex removed as a result of various medical issues, and yet they went on to achieve in school relatively fine. Actually, they were okay. Even though one of them had their left hemisphere entirely removed, they still had reasonable language skills. So the way in which the cortex can rewire itself is quite incredible, but it rewires itself with the help of input from these subcortical systems. Of course, it is bidirectional. But certainly if there is a problem with some of these subcortical systems, and they're smaller, so sometimes they're more difficult to pick up on fMRI images, but there's likely to have it could potentially have a serious impact on the way in which the cortex organizes itself, and could explain why you get all of those other differences in the cortex, which are much easier to pick up using fMRI, simply because they're bigger, really. Okay, so we are beginning to implicate abnormalities in dorsal anterior cingulate, lateral prefrontal cortex. These are becoming through as potentially important roles, but this striatum system, the reward system, has actually developed into the mainstream theory, if you like, in cognitive neuroscience and ADHD. So I know there are some people here who want to do other cognitive neuroscience theories about ADHD, and that's fine. But I think you do need to deal with the theory that has come through so strongly. It's not the only theory. It has been challenged. Actually, I'll be giving you a section of a paper in the workshop that is challenging it, and that's fine. But because it's become so influential, it does need to be mentioned, I think. And what we're looking at here, what are we looking at here? We're looking at control activations where we see this would be dorsal anterior cingulate activating. It's a transverse section, but not activating. You don't see any yellow activations for ADHDs. The red activations is the control group. And we do see differences in activation between the yellow and the red, the yellow being ADHD, red again being the control group for the lateral prefrontal cortex, which is part of that potential system that's in charge of how you allocate attention. Dorsal anterior cingulate, and dorsal anterior cingulate is the more cognitive part, and prefrontal cortex. Okay, so did you want to ask any questions about that before we talk about the drugs? So how do the drugs work? Well, the understanding is still hazy, not just about ADHD, but also how some of the drugs appear to relieve it. And in fact, a lot of what has contributed to our understanding of the cognitive neuroscience of ADHD is our understanding of how the drugs work. So the drugs were being applied before we had any understanding of what actually they were really doing, which you might find strange, but this is really quite common in psychiatry. There's an awful lot of examples of this, whereby they find a drug that influences, some part of the brain or another, and they think, well, that might be good for schizophrenia, or it might be good for that. But the actual evidence for how it's operating can often be quite hazy. So looking at children's behavior changing apparently for the better, and looking at when they're taking methylphenidate, and then looking at the neural correlates of change in relation to methylphenidate, give us an additional clue as to what ADHD actually is. Now, when I was talking about the striatum uptaking dopamine, particularly the ventral striatum, we're talking about increasing signals between the striatum and the rest of the cortex. And when that happens, that's about increasing the saliency of your chocolate cake or whatever you are actually looking at. What methylphenidate appears to do is to block the transporters that take away the excess dopamine, well, or the dopamine. So once the dopamine is acted, these transporters are very good at cleaning things up. But of course, they're also responsible for reducing the levels of the dopamine generally. If you block, using Ritalin, these dopamine transporters, then you end up with more dopamine sloshing around the reward system. And that's the underlying theory about how Ritalin operates. And of course, it ties in quite nicely with the with the dopamine deficit hypothesis about ADHD. And I'm just about to show you some images from the Volko study, but notice that that's 2005. And the paper that I showed you was one of the first papers to suggest the dopamine deficit theory, and that was 2007. So it's kind of like happens in the wrong order, doesn't it? So to understand these images, this is one of the things I thought, oh, I'm never going to be able to photocopy this out to show you, really. To understand these images, it's kind of like in reverse. This is a PET study, and remember that positron emission tomography attaches particular markers to radioactivity, which then they can be used to target particular parts of the brain. And these particular markers operate by increasing the radioactivity. The end result is that you get an increase in radioactivity when there is low dopamine. Okay, so it's the opposite way around. And what they're doing is comparing a placebo, which is just a tablet without the Ritalin, so they don't know they're taking it, with methylphenidate, when people are doing either a mathematical task or just a neutral task. Now that's important because a neutral task, you haven't given them a stimulus really to attend to. So you might not see a great increase in dopamine activity. Now what you find is, there is most activity for the methylphenidate and the mathematical task, although it looks here as if there is least activity. That's the way it's supposed to be. So you look at the image, let's say which is least bright, and it's this one here, and that means there is most dopamine in the system because it operates the other way around, this marker. And that corresponds to taking methylphenidate and doing a mathematical task. So both of those things should be engaging the reward system. And you see, and that's what you see. You see the most dopamine because you've got the least signal. But what's perhaps interesting here as well is that when you've got the placebo and the mathematical task, you see a much brighter image here, which means there's much less dopamine. Okay. They also asked them, how motivated are you when you're doing this task? And they answered on a scale of 1 to 6. And they could also calculate the percentage change in dopamine activity from the images. And you can see this is the sort of graph I would love to get in my research sometimes. So when it all comes out, oh, that's so lovely. Occasionally it happens, unfortunately not. Usually it could happen, but there's one little, you'll find this with your dissertation, there's usually one little dot up here which completely ruins it. And you've got no, anyway, I digress. Okay, so there's a lovely linear relationship between the change in dopamine and the reported self-motivation, which is what you'd expect, because the more dopamine in the reward system, the more you really want to do something. And, you know, I think this is, I think the grey one is with the placebo and the black one is with the dopamine. So you can see that there is a difference in the self-reported for the two medical treatments as well. So there is also a hope that Ritalin may actually normalize the striatal function as well. So this is a recent study showing associations of age and the percentage of patients receiving stimulant medication, in other words, methylphenidate, with more normal grey matter volumes in the right basal ganglia. Essentially, what these graphs are showing is that as you get older, so you are actually increasing the amount of grey matter in the basal ganglia, which is an important part of that reward system that we were talking about. So, there's a sense in which there is some evidence to suggest that Ritalin or methylphenidate can have positive long-term effects, even when you're not taking it, so sort of longer-term positive effects. But there's also plenty of concern about the extent to which the drugs are being prescribed. And these are drugs that actually normal, healthy people can benefit from as well. So they represent the most common prescription drug that is used as a cognitive enhancing drug amongst certainly students in the United States, where almost a third of students in some universities are using them in order to pass exams. So, there's all sorts of issues here about the medicalization, if you like, of our lives. Yes.
I've seen some videos that parents actually complain that their children, after taking the medication, they might just sit on the couch with no appetite at all, not
yes.
anything, not wanting to eat. And
yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of. I don't know. I think generally, the research seems to show that the pharmaceutical approach to dealing with ADHD is an important part of the treatment. It's been shown to improve cognitive function, and it's been shown to improve the behavior that needs to be managed inside the school. But interestingly, there's very little evidence to show it actually improves educational achievement. So that raises the question of what its value is in educational terms. And it appears to be in terms of improving the manageability of the children on that basis, you might say. So there's some big issues about it. Anyway, if the university system will allow me to broadcast these, there's a couple of interesting.
Any other questions, madam?
Do you have Sunny FlexiPay? That thing where you pick your repayment schedule?
No.
It's the last thing we need.
How to recognize ADHD symptoms in children. Is your child high-spirited and unfocused, or suffering from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? These ADHD guidelines will help you decide if the checkup is in order. You will need an analysis of their behavior, an idea of how long it's been going on, and a visit to the pediatrician. Step 1. Note their capacity for concentrating. Most young children have short attention spans, but those with ADHD don't seem to be listening even when they're spoken to. They frequently lose things, have difficulty following instructions, and often make careless mistakes. Step 2. Recognize if their energy level seems excessive, even for a child. Are they unable to sit without fidgeting? Do they get in trouble at school for leaving their seat, or running and climbing excessively or inappropriately? Do they talk incessantly? Interrupt constantly? Some children are more inattentive than hyperactive, and vice versa. Girls are more likely to have more attention problems, while boys more often fall into the hyperactive category. Step 3. Consider how long the behavior has been going on. If you've observed symptoms for more than 6 months, it might be ADHD. Step 4. Note where the behavior takes place. If it's only at home or only in school, something other than ADHD may be to blame for their symptoms. Step 5. Gauge the seriousness of the problem. Children with ADHD are regularly disruptive at school and at home. Their behavior causes problems in their relationships with both adults and other children. Step 6. If you recognize any of these symptoms in your child, take them to your pediatrician. It's important that they have a medical checkup to rule out other causes for their behavior before ADHD is diagnosed. Did you know children whose mothers had smoked while pregnant were more than twice as likely to have ADHD as children whose mothers did not smoke?
Doesn't necessarily mean it's the smoking, though, does it? Necessarily. I mean, it could just be sort of correlated to socioeconomic background, or it could be a third factor involved. Okay, so that's interesting. I was smiling then. I was just thinking about how many of those symptoms I can see in my own child and myself. But certainly, he never stops talking. He's constantly interrupting, and he's really quite hyperactive actually. So let's have a look. But I don't regard him as having ADHD. But let's have a look at this one here. So this is for adults. Do you fit these symptoms?
How to recognize adult ADHD symptoms. Some of the symptoms associated with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, can become more pronounced with age, while others were more subtle. These guidelines will help you determine if you or a loved one have a problem. You will need childhood history, behavior analysis, an honest assessment, and a mental health expert. Step 1. Review childhood history for behavioral problems and poor grades. Most adults with ADHD showed symptoms as children, though factors such as higher intelligence or strong structure at home or school might have obscured their symptoms as children. Step 2. Consider if anxiety, major depression, or substance abuse are also problems. Research has found that 4 out of 5 adults with ADHD show signs of at least one other psychiatric disorder. Step 3. Recognize the behaviors and symptoms common to adults with ADHD. Chronic lateness and forgetfulness.
Yeah.
Low self-esteem. Difficulty controlling anger. Impulsiveness, poor organization skills, chronic boredom, difficulty concentrating when reading, mood swings, and troubled relationships. Adults with ADHD often have multiple divorces, spotty employment records, and repeated driving violations. Step 4. Know the criteria for ADHD in adults. 6 or more symptoms of inattention or hyperactivity that have lasted at least 6 months, causing trouble in 2 or more areas of their life, like marriage or work. Adults with ADHD are more likely to suffer from inattention rather than the physical hyperactivity associated with childhood ADHD. Step 5. If you recognized yourself or a loved one in these symptoms, consult a mental health professional. Adult ADHD can be controlled with medication and therapy. Did you know? Brain scans of adults with ADHD suggested a flaw in the way they process dopamine, the brain chemical that plays an important role in motivation, reward, working memory, and learning.
Well, there you go. I think I scored 9 out of 10 on that. I haven't got any driving violations. Not yet, anyway. Okay, so I mean, there's a lot of food for thought there. You know, at the end of the day, a lot of those are quite normal human behaviours that we see all the time. On the other hand, and we know that actually the drugs can help all of us in some respects. So we are left with what essentially is a problem that we have to discuss as a society in terms of how, at what level, at what point we decide that something is ADHD rather than just misbehavior, if you like. And also other issues such as self-regulation. So there's a lot of work at the moment on self-regulation. How much does that play a role? Something which is being investigated now. Okay, so there's all sorts of arguments with some powerful lobbies, actually, against the use of prescription drugs. Some classic cases of well-known artists who have been ADHD and used Ritalin a lot in their lives. Did anyone know who this is? Kurt Cobain, yeah. And he said, when you're a kid and you get this drug that makes you feel that you're feeling, that makes you feel that feeling, where else are you going to turn when you're an adult? So there's an idea that being on prescription drugs at an early age makes it more likely to turn to other drugs later on. So there's all sorts of, this is a very popular story in the press. Newsweek, Daily Mail, of course, The Sun, Daily Telegraph. Sometimes, you know, it does turn children into robots. Sometimes it doesn't turn children into robots. It's a discussion which is happening a lot in the public media, and it has a lot to do with the brain, because much of what we understand about ADHD is from neuroscience, and a very large part of the treatment is psychoactive drugs. I should mention that there are challenges to this prefrontal striatal model. So don't write an essay saying we know it's this, because you should look at least, for example, studies such as Castellanos, who have challenged the prefrontal striatal dopamine deficiency model. And education requires multi-perspective approaches. It can't just be about drugs, surely. And there are multi-agency and multimodal approaches to handling ADHD. And I would hope that teachers could become more involved with these types of issue, in the sense that teachers are possibly the best people placed to make day-to-day observations about children's behaviour. I mean, certainly my child's primary school teacher sees more of him during the day than I do. And there are things which teachers can have concerns about, which probably would benefit from a broader understanding of brain function. What improvements are, for example, the artifacts of the medication? What self-esteem effects are associated with taking the medication, being on drugs, if you like? What are the usual ups and downs you might observe, and what's the expected rebound when the medication is missed? You know, you often hear teachers saying, well, he missed his tablets, left his tablets at home today. You know. Yeah.
Well, don't you think it's interesting that, like, OCD is kind of almost the opposite, where you're attending correctly, no. So in turn, we often for CBT, but something like deficit disorder, which affects those people when they're self, let's pick up.
Yes. Yeah, why is that then? Yeah, there are CB. Yes, I mean, actually, the advert was suggesting counselling, wasn't it? There could be talking therapies that might help.
I think results of studies have shown that theoretically it doesn't have as big an impact.
Yeah. I'm not sure, though, that there is necessarily a very effective drug associated with OCD. Don't know. Not as effective as Ritalin is for ADHD.
They do give sometimes a Citalopram for OCD, but that doesn't really, or other RSS medications, but it's not really effective.
Serotonin suppressors. Yes. Well, these are arguments we can have in Issues in Neuroscience and Education if you're on that unit. So, you know, it has been criticised as well, this neuroscience approach for the pharmaceutical approach for discounting the uniqueness of the individual and the meaning of interpersonal experience. Children who are taking the drugs possibly believing that they have a broken brain. Other approaches include contingency management in the classroom, peer tutoring, computer-assisted instruction, task and instructional modification, strategy training. All of those things have been tried. And I suppose the reason I'm showing you this is really that I was going to say that there's not very much effect. No, there isn't very much effect on school achievement. Sorry, because actually these are maths tasks, but they're not necessarily related to academic achievement. Okay. So using these types of cognitive outcomes, you can see the relative effects of different approaches to ADHD. And in terms of general cognition, it looks like the psychological educational is actually doing better than the pharmacological, which is interesting. And parent training as well. The multimodal appears to have a negative effect on maths. Is that statistically significant? It's kind of worrying, if so. But the best ADHD interventions are probably ones which do take into account the other agencies that are involved, such as teachers and parents, and most importantly, perhaps the child themselves. So we've talked about working memory, we've talked about the supervisory attentional system, we've talked about the key regions that are involved with attention, such as anterior cingulate, and the prefrontal cortex. And we've talked about attention deficit disorder, which does involve deficits, in some of those regions, but may actually, according to the dopamine deficit theory, be caused by a problem in the reward system. Are there any questions? Final comments or thoughts? Yes.
When we talk about challenges to the prefrontal development, do the other theories still generally think that there's dopamine deficiency, but that it affects more of the brain, or do other theories think something different to the dopamine deficiency?
Well, some of them think something different to the dopamine deficiency theory. Yeah. I mean, it kind of ties in with one of the things we were looking at yesterday, the Karmiloff-Smith study, where they were looking at, I think it was, I can't remember now, but one of the studies that we looked at was about gaze behavior and the fact that a connectionist model shows that the linking of reward to gaze, and they do believe that there is a link to that, can actually explain some of the effects that you get in Williams syndrome and autism, I think. And then they were saying, well, maybe we should be applying this to ADHD, this connectionist approach as well. So, you have this idea that something very fundamental in terms of one of these subcortical systems could actually be responsible for a lot of differences in behavior, which you wouldn't normally associate with reward, over the trajectory of the development, because you're learning in a different way, essentially, which I find very powerful as an idea. But it is good that these ideas are being challenged. But I think, yes, there are certainly people who don't think it's anything to do with dopamine.
Because if it was to do with dopamine, surely there would be better ways of trying to increase the dopamine.
Ah, well, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Yes. So, for example, what increases dopamine uptake? Video games. And you often see children who are diagnosed with ADHD having no trouble whatsoever attending to a video game. So there are environmental changes that you can introduce which will increase the midbrain response. And we're going to be, if we ever sign the contract, hopefully today, we're going to be trialing these teaching through games approaches in the classroom. And my guess is that children who have problems with attention will actually respond quite well to those, I hope. Because
there's a child at the moment that I'm teaching who's been diagnosed with ADHD, and if you see him playing a computer game or playing outside in there's like a forest school area, you wouldn't notice that he didn't stand out at all. But as soon as you put him in the classroom, he stands out.
Yeah, so these games, I mean, you could describe them as environmental Ritalin. I mean, one of the negatives to this, I suppose, is if you're going to start developing a classroom as a video game, is that skills such as self-regulation and working on your patience so that you can sit through a really boring lecture or a really boring lesson without causing hysteria or problems. Actually, it's probably a good skill that you do need to develop. So you need to have practice at that, and you're all doing very well, may I say. So because some of these lectures I did have a sort of gaming element too. I would say, what's the best way of teaching? I don't know is the answer, but I do think it's worth experimenting with these video game approaches to teaching, because we know they accelerate learning. We don't know what the downside might be, but then if we don't try it, we won't know, will we? So, but it is very experimental. Hello.
It seems that with ADHD, whatever, if you give a stimulant, whether that's Ritalin or a video game, dopamine's released and that calms down. So, is that a general thing you can say that the teaching some of the disorders kind of stimulate, with the stimulant?
Well, they're understimulated in a way. I mean, in terms of their response, yeah.
So it will have the opposite effect if you gave that to somebody without ADHD.
Well, all it does is increase your stimulus-specific reward and thereby your attention. But actually, it's a good point that I'm talking about. So presumably it does the same thing. So when students take these cognitive enhancing, when they take methylphenidate to improve their exams, they actually find they get more pleasure they describe from reading a book.
It's just that I find the whole thing of treating a silver stimulant with a stimulant and then calm them down. Because I've also read, I don't know if you've heard, that if you give a can of Coke or a cup of coffee to a child with ADHD, they'll actually feel tired rather than stimulate it.
Well, after a while, caffeine does reduce, but initially you would think it would stimulate. So the one thing I ought to point out is that we're talking about midbrain dopamine as if there's some linear relationship between dopamine uptake and orientation of attention and working memory and all those other things to do with allocating resources. And actually, it's not linear. It's actually it can be an inverted U-shaped. So it depends where you are on it. So different people are at different points on here. And the idea is that children with ADHD are mostly down there. So this is your dopamine, and let's say this is your level of stimulus. And that level of stimulus is producing a lower level than it might do for a normal person. So you increase that by adding the methylphenidate artificially. But you've got to be careful because some people will already be over here. And so when you actually increase their dopamine, so increase the stimulus, you're going to actually decrease the amount of dopamine they're producing. Or if you give them methylphenidate, it'll have the same effect and actually decrease the amount of dopamine. So sorry, actually a different way of putting this, better way of putting this would be to say dopamine down there and oh God. Is there a pen at the back? Because I ought to show this in terms of cognitive function really and dopamine. Is there a whiteboard pen? Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much. Could you pass it forward? Well, that'll get my dopamine going. Okay, so we're assuming, actually it's not much better. We're assuming that as you increase the dopamine, let's say this is working memory. It's another rubbish pen. Oh, it's completely rubbish pen. As you increase the dopamine, so you increase your working memory or your attention or whatever. But once you're past the top, you'll get the opposite effect. And you've got a sort of inverted U shape. So you've got to be a little bit careful with this. And when you look at this inverted U shape for different age groups, interestingly, oh, let's try another one.
Is that a whiteboard?
I don't care anymore. Yeah, no, it is. So this is working memory or attention. And this is dopamine down here. And actually, what you can see for different age groups, you actually shift this backwards and forwards. And it's about the age of sort of 13, you tend to sort of get the sort of biggest sort of peak, which is quite interesting. So your response is maximal at 13. But the inverted U shape is important because it reminds us that we're all individuals, and actually the response to taking methylphenidate or the response to video games may be different for different people. Okay, so are there any other questions? Yes.
Does the effect of like video games and listening on drinking levels last for any longer than you're playing that game for your
We don't believe so. The response is quite rapid, so it's like a number of seconds.
So like playing a video game
3 or 4 seconds. No, but the effect on memory, because I said that dopamine increases synaptic plasticity, which is true, but interestingly, it's a retroactive effect. So the learning, when we played that game, I was doing that in order to increase your learning of neuroanatomy ready for your test by increasing your dopamine when we were talking about the concepts. But actually, I probably timed it quite well because it was a week before, because it takes about a week for the dopamine to actually have the effect on the memory consolidation. So it's about the consolidation of memory about a week later really makes a difference. The immediate effects of increasing dopamine on learning, anyway, are not always that observable, but they probably will be in terms of attention and therefore management of behaviour in the classroom. Yes.
Is it the level of dopamine produced or absorbed?
It's the uptake of dopamine in the ventral striatum, and it starts down a bit lower down the brain in the ventral tegmental area, and it's drawn up into that region. And then there are connections going from the reward system all around the cortex. And we think it's those connections introducing dopamine to the wider regions of the cortex that increases the learning. So the reward signal is about dopamine moving from the ventral tegmental area up to the ventral striatum. But then it's those connections to the cortex which actually increase the learning. Good. Okay, so if there's anybody who's not at the workshop and they want to ask me a question about the assignment, feel free to ask now. Put your hand up if you're not coming to the workshop. Oh, okay, so most of you are coming to the workshop. I hope we could all fit in the room then. Okay. We're just going to be talking about cause and effect in the workshop, but there are some slides that will be on Blackboard. Okay, are we ready to break for lunch then? Good, lovely to see you. See you again. Oh, 406, isn't it? Usually it's 406. I imagine it's the same room as last time. 406.
Just a quick recap. It's okay if I do it on the neuroplasticity of motor cortex, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think